Okay, let's talk about one of the most common and most complicated excuses out there. I didn't know. We all hear it, we've all probably used it, but when is it a real excuse, and when does it actually make things worse?
I mean, you've seen this one, right? It happens all the time online. Someone says something that really crosses a line, people get upset, and this is the first line of defense.
Or maybe you've heard this one, maybe in a workplace setting. The person isn't arguing about what they did, they're arguing that they just didn't know it was wrong.
And then there's this one, which is a really powerful argument. It's the idea that, hey, this wasn't just my blind spot. This was the whole culture. My ignorance wasn't personal, it was normal.
So that brings us to the core question here. If somebody genuinely, truly believes they aren't doing anything wrong, does that get them off the hook? Does that absolve them of all responsibility? Or is it more complicated than that? To really get to the bottom of this, first, we have to split not knowing into two different categories. On the one hand, you've got factual ignorance. This is pretty straightforward. Say you give a friend a snack, not knowing they have a severe peanut allergy. You were just missing a key fact. But what we're really diving into today is moral ignorance. This is when you know all the facts. For instance, you know exactly how low the wages you pay are, but you genuinely don't see anything morally wrong with it. You think it's just business. And that's where everything gets so messy.
And the reason it gets so messy is that most of us are pulled in two completely different directions. We have these two powerful, competing gut feelings about it. So gut feeling number one is often empathy. Our first instinct is to think, well, you can't really blame someone for something they genuinely didn't understand, right? It feels unfair to judge them as harshly as you judge someone who knew exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. And this intuition makes total sense in some cases. We don't hold a small child accountable for not understanding complex ethics. We can imagine how someone raised in total isolation might not know any better. In these extreme cases, our gut tells us to separate the harmful action from the person's actual blameworthiness. But then, just as strong, this other intuition kicks in. You hear, I didn't know, and a voice in the back of your head just screams, yeah, but you should have known better. This phrase really nails that feeling. It's like, okay, I can understand the reasons for your ignorance, but I'm not giving you a free pass. It taps into this really deep belief that as adults, we have a responsibility to pay attention, to question things, and to actually listen when people are telling us we're causing harm. So how do we square these two things? How do we resolve this conflict between it's not their fault and they should have known better? Well, it turns out philosophers have a really useful framework for this, and it all comes down to one key distinction.
And here it is, not all ignorance is created equal. We can split it into two types. First, there's non-culpable ignorance. Culpable just means blameworthy. So this is innocent, non-blameworthy ignorance. You didn't know, and there was no reasonable way you could have known. But then there's culpable ignorance. This is the blameworthy kind. This is when, yeah, you didn't know, but you should have. Your ignorance wasn't an accident. It was a failure to listen, a failure to question, a failure to care.
All right, so let's break down that first one. What actually makes ignorance non-culpable? When is it a legitimate excuse? Well, for ignorance to be a genuine excuse, the conditions are actually pretty high. We're talking about situations where someone truly had no real chance to learn any better. Think of being raised in a completely sealed-off environment. Or cases where you were totally shielded from anyone who disagreed, or from the perspectives of the people being harmed. Your age or cognitive ability obviously plays a part. And a huge one is being systematically lied to by every single trusted authority in your life. It's easy to see how your moral compass would be off. Okay, so that's one side. Now for the other. When does not knowing stop being an excuse and actually become part of the problem itself? This is where ignorance becomes an active choice. It's not an excuse if you had access to better information but just chose to ignore it. It's not an excuse if not knowing was convenient for you, if it protected your comfort, your status, your bottom line. And it is especially not an excuse if you actively silenced or avoided the very people who were trying to tell you that something was wrong. At that point, it's not an accident. It's chosen ignorance. So let's put this framework to the test. How does it help us with one of the toughest arguments out there, especially when we look at history? Well, they were just people of their time. Well, what's great about this framework is it gives us a much more nuanced answer than a simple yes or no. On the one hand, of course, context matters. What seems obvious to us now might not have been then. But on the other hand, even in the most unjust periods of history, there were almost always people saying, this is wrong. There were dissenters, there were abolitionists, there were victims speaking out. So the real question isn't just, what year was it? The question is, did that person have access to those dissenting voices? And did they choose to ignore them or fight them? That choice makes all the difference.
And this all leads to a really powerful final point. Being a good person isn't a static thing. It's not a set of rules you learn when you're a kid and then you're done. It's an active, ongoing responsibility to keep learning.
And that moral growth takes real work. It means intentionally listening to people whose lives are different from ours. It means truly hearing the stories of people who are being harmed by the way things are, especially when it's uncomfortable. It requires being humble enough to change our minds. And brave enough to admit, you know what? I was wrong about that.
So, in the end, I didn't know can be an excuse, but only when that ignorance was truly unavoidable. The moment it starts coming from laziness, from convenience, or from a stubborn refusal to listen to uncomfortable truths, it stops being an excuse. It becomes a symptom of the moral failure itself.
And that leaves all of us with a final question to think about. Not about other people, but about ourselves. In our own lives, whose voices, whose experiences might we be tuning out simply because it's easier not to listen? Because that responsibility to know better, that's on all of us.